The Whitmore is one of those co-op buildings that wears its age like a credential. 6 stories of 1920s brick on the west side of a city that has gentrified around it without quite managing to touch it, home to 4 dozen units, and a residents' association that has governed itself, sometimes well, mostly with considerable drama, for the better part of 40 years. The lobby still has the original terrazzo floor. The elevator still requires a key. And on the 4th floor, in Unit 4C, Renata Voss had lived for 3 years with the particular fluency of someone who had already made her mistakes elsewhere. She'd been in an HOA before. A different building, a different city, a different version of herself. Younger, quicker to argue, less careful about the battles she chose. She fought a board there over a noise complaint that turned into a formal hearing that turned into her packing boxes at 2 a.m. and swearing she'd never let herself get tangled up in association politics again. 3 years at the Whitmore, and she kept that promise, mostly by staying invisible. She attended the annual meeting, paid her assessments on time, nodded at her neighbors in the elevator, and offered nothing further. It was working fine, until her sister Delia's due date crept close enough to matter. Delia lived 40 minutes away in a cramped studio and had asked one thing, for the months she'd been pregnant. A real baby shower, somewhere with room for people to actually breathe. Renata had the largest unit in the building. She had the space, and so she filed the request, the way the Whitmore's residential handbook required. Written notice to the association board 14 days in advance, event type, estimated attendance, duration, cleanup plan. 17 guests. 3 hours. A Sunday afternoon. She'd done everything the handbook asked. What happened next was something the handbook had not anticipated, because the handbook had not anticipated Claudette Marsh. Claudette had lived in the Whitmore since 1987. She held no official board position. She'd been voted off the committee 4 years earlier in a recall that the building still whispered about, but she had the institutional memory of someone who had been there long enough to believe that length of time was the same as authority. She did not like baby showers. More precisely, she did not like what baby showers represented, which was the building filling up with exactly the kind of younger, louder, more festive residents that she feared would eventually make her feel like a stranger in her own home. She had watched the Whitmore shift around her for years, younger families moving in, older long-timers moving out or passing away, and every balloon in a hallway felt, to her, like one more piece of evidence that she was being displaced. This was not something Claudette would have said aloud. What she said instead, 2 days after Renata's request was submitted, was that the common areas had never been intended for private commercial events, that the handbook's guest provisions were being misread, and that she intended to raise a formal objection at the next board session. That session was 4 days before the shower date. Renata knew the meeting was happening because Augustine Ford, the board's longest-serving current member and the closest thing the Whitmore had to an honest broker, knocked on her door the evening before and told her, with the plainness of a man who had seen this cycle too many times, that she ought to be there. She almost didn't go. Her tongue. Always her problem. Always the thing that had gotten her into trouble before. The sharpness that could strip paint off a wall when she felt cornered was something she'd been managing carefully for 3 years. She knew that if Claudette pushed her in a room full of people, she might push back in a way that cost her. But Augustine had said be there, and so she went. What strikes me about moments like this one, a woman who has already learned her lesson once, choosing whether to walk into the same kind of room, is how much courage it takes to do nothing dramatic. Staying calm when someone is manufacturing a crisis around you is not passivity. It's a skill most of us never develop. The board session was in the second-floor meeting room, a narrow space with folding chairs and a long table that had seen better decades. Renata arrived to find 7 residents already seated, Claudette among them in the front row with a printed document in her lap. The 3 sitting board members, Augustine, a younger woman named Plea Okafor who worked in city planning, and a retiree named Leonard Chu, sat at the table. Claudette was given the floor. She spoke for 11 minutes. She cited Section 4.2 of the Residential Handbook, the guest policy, and argued that 17 outside guests constituted a use of common building resources that exceeded what the section permitted. She argued that the hallway, the elevator, and the lobby all qualified as shared resources that would be strained. She argued, and this was the part that made Renata's thumb press hard into her palm, that the board had a responsibility to the building's long-standing character and residential peace. She never used the word noise. She never said anything directly unkind. But the thing she was afraid of was visible in every sentence, the way a person's real feeling tends to leak through even the most carefully constructed objection. Renata waited. She had prepared what she was going to say. She had written it down at her kitchen table the night before because she did not trust herself to stay measured without a script. When she was recognized by Plea, she read from the paper in her hand. Section 4.2 permitted residential gatherings of up to 25 guests with 14-day advance notice. She had given 14-day advance notice. The section contained no prohibition on the occasion type. There was no language in the handbook about building character as a qualifying or disqualifying criterion. She had followed the process. She would like the board to confirm that her event was approved as submitted. Then she sat down. She did not say the other things she had written and crossed out. The line about Claudette not owning the building just because she'd lived there the longest. The line about how a baby shower was not a commercial event by any reasonable interpretation of language. She crossed those out because she knew from experience, from the boxes she'd packed at 2 a.m., that winning the argument in the room was less important than winning the vote, and you didn't win votes by making the undecided people feel uncomfortable. Augustine called for a motion. Plea moved to approve Renata's event as submitted. Leonard seconded. The vote was 2-1. Leonard, to no one's surprise, voted with Claudette's position, though Claudette had no vote. The event was approved. Claudette left without speaking to anyone. And then something strange happened. Quick note, this is a fictional, AI-assisted story made for education and entertainment. All names and characters are invented. Now, back to the story. In the 4 days between the board vote and the shower, 3 separate residents approached Renata in the hallway or the lobby to tell her that Claudette had spoken to them. Had told them, individually, that the board had made an error, that the approval was improper, and that they might want to reconsider whether they wanted this kind of event normalized in the building. Renata learned this from a neighbor on the 3rd floor who came to her door visibly uncomfortable, saying she thought Renata should know. This was the inversion. Renata had spent 3 years believing that her silence and careful compliance were what kept her safe in this building, and now she was learning that her restraint had simply made space for someone else to define her. The neighbors who came to tell her what Claudette was doing were not hostile. They were embarrassed for their building. They were, Renata realized, waiting for someone to give them permission to say so. She made a decision that, in hindsight, she still isn't entirely sure was right. She sent an email to the full building listserv, a thing she had never done in 3 years, attaching the board's written approval, quoting the relevant section of the handbook verbatim, and noting that the event was approved, properly filed, and she looked forward to welcoming her sister and her guests on Sunday. She did not mention Claudette by name. She did not say anything that a reasonable person could call an attack, but it was the most publicly visible thing she had done since moving in, and she knew it. Let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. If you're finding value in this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you've ever experienced a similar HOA or neighborhood situation, feel free to share your story in the comments. The response was the evidence that changed everything. Within 24 hours, 9 residents had replied to the listserv. Not in anger, in solidarity. One woman, who had lived in the building for 12 years, wrote that she had wanted to host her mother's retirement celebration 2 years ago and had quietly dropped the idea after a conversation with Claudette made her feel the request wasn't worth the trouble. A man on the 5th floor said he'd been told informally that the guest policy wasn't really meant for parties. A couple on the 2nd floor said they believed the building discouraged events of any kind because of something a long-term resident had told them when they moved in. They had never filed a formal request because they assumed it would be denied. Nobody had ever checked the actual handbook. They had all simply absorbed Claudette's interpretation of the rules as if it were the rules themselves. This was the community shift. What had begun as Renata defending her sister's baby shower became, in the span of one email thread, something larger. Residents who had never spoken to each other about this were speaking now. And what they were saying was that the building they thought they lived in, a building with restrictive, unwelcoming policies about gatherings, was not the building the handbook described. The handbook was reasonable. The restriction had been Claudette. Then came the antagonist overreach, the moment that even Claudette's oldest allies in the building could not explain away. On the Friday before the shower, a hand-delivered note appeared under the doors of all 44 units. It was typed and signed, and it stated that residents should be aware that an unapproved commercial event was being held on Sunday, that the board had exceeded its authority in granting permission, and that any residents who wished to file a formal complaint with the co-op's managing corporation should contact the corporation directly. It included the managing corporation's address. It did not include the writer's name, but the building knew. The building had always known how Claudette communicated when she felt she was losing. Augustine Ford brought the note to the board's attention that same afternoon and requested an emergency session. Here, the legal framework came into clear focus. Under New York co-op governance law and the Whitmore's own bylaws, which mirrored state requirements, the board was required to operate transparently, and any formal complaint to the managing corporation that originated from within the board itself had to be disclosed to all members. More critically, the co-op's bylaws required that any attempt to reverse or challenge a properly voted board decision had to go through a formal petition process requiring signatures from 20% of unit owners, not anonymous letters under doors. Claudette had not filed a petition. She had run a pressure campaign. And when Plea laid the building's bylaws flat on the table at the emergency session, the distinction between what Claudette had done and what the governance structure actually permitted was not subtle. The mirror moment came for Renata that Friday night, sitting at her kitchen table after the emergency session, reading the chain of emails from her neighbors one more time. She had spent 3 years being invisible in this building to avoid exactly this kind of conflict. She had told herself it was wisdom. But looking at the message from the woman on the 12th floor who had quietly given up her mother's party, Renata recognized something she hadn't wanted to see. Her silence had not been neutral. It had been a form of permission. Every resident who had absorbed Claudette's version of the rules without checking had made the same choice Renata had made. Don't make noise, don't draw attention, don't be the one who causes trouble. And that collective silence was what had given an unofficial, unelected woman's preferences the weight of policy for years. The shower happened on Sunday. Delia arrived in her yellow floral dress, with 17 people who filled the apartment with noise and laughter, and a very large cake shaped like a rubber duck. The hallway smelled like flowers. The elevator made 4 more trips than usual. Not a single resident complained. 2 of them knocked on the open door to offer congratulations to Delia, strangers who had read the email chain and decided that a pregnant woman deserved to be welcomed properly. Claudette's door at the end of the 2nd floor stayed closed all afternoon. Not every story ends with a confrontation. Some of them end with a door quietly shut and a building deciding, room by room and floor by floor, which version of itself it wants to be. 3 weeks after the shower, Augustine called a special meeting to review the residential handbook. Not to restrict it, to clarify it, to write down, explicitly, what the guest and event policies actually said, so that no one's informal interpretation could substitute for the actual language again. 11 residents showed up. Renata was one of them. She brought her copy of the handbook with her margin notes. She did not give a speech. She answered the questions she was asked, directly, and without the sharpness she'd been working so hard to contain, and when the session ended she stayed to help fold the chairs. Quiet justice doesn't arrive with a gavel. Sometimes it arrives with a building that finally reads its own rules. The thing about governance by intimidation, whether it happens in a co-op, an HOA, a workplace, or anywhere else, is that it only works when the people it targets assume they're alone. Renata didn't win because she was louder or angrier than Claudette. She won because she sent 1 email and 17 years of other people's silence answered back. Real talk. Stories like Renata's only spread when people share them. If someone you know is dealing with an HOA situation right now, or has quietly given up something they had every right to do, send them this video. It might be the most useful thing in their inbox this week. Like, subscribe, and we'll keep finding the stories that actually matter. Thank you, genuinely.